Okay, I want to do this broadcast on looking back on God's faithfulness and relying on how He has worked in our lives in the past. I think this is a very important thing. I mean, as you go through the Christian life, you'll encounter struggles and trials and challenges. But as we get through each of these challenges, I think they serve us a little reminder of how God has faithfully provided and got us through things in the past. And that gives us something to look back on and see how God has worked for us in the past, and it enables us to trust Him more when the next challenge comes up. And I want to just look at this passage where, David is being hunted down by Saul, and David ends up going to the priest and trying to inquire of God. And so he says, David asked Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapons because the king's mission was urgent." The priest replied, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine who you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, you can take it." "There was no sword here but that one." David said, "There is none like it, give it to me." And so this sword that he ended up retrieving after he killed Goliath became like a trophy sword. It became like a little reminder of that battle where he had faced the defiant giant Goliath, and the Lord had gave him victory over it. And the sword was a continual reminder. Yes, God delivered my enemy into my hands, my enemy who defiantly mocked God and said he would give my body to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And so Goliath would mock David and say, I'll give your dead carcass to the wild birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And we see God ended up bringing Goliath down. And it was David who trusted the Lord and did God's will, and he had the fearless confidence to stand up to Goliath because he knew Goliath was mocking God. And he's like, you're not going to get away with mocking God. No matter how big you are, you're going to fall. And so we see Goliath fell, and David ends up cutting off his head and keeping the sword of Goliath. And so that was a continual reminder to David, God delivered me out of the hands of this horrible enemy. When David was actually facing Goliath, he does something else like this. He said, "As surely as the Lord lives, who delivered me out of the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, surely God will deliver me out of the hands of this Philistine." So David not only is looking back on how God's delivered when Saul is hunting him, he has the sword of Goliath there, but when he faces Goliath for the first time, David said, well, the Lord has shown himself faithful to deliver me out of the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear when I was shepherding sheep. Surely God will come through again and deliver me from the hands of the Philistines. So David constantly kept looking back. Whenever he faced a challenge, David always looked back on how God had faithfully provided in the past, and he drew strength and confidence from God's past victories and delivering him from dangerous situations in the past. In the case of being hunted by Saul, he looked at the sword of Goliath. In the case of facing Goliath, he looked back on the incidents with the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear that God delivered him out of the hands of. So I think as believers, as we go through challenges and crises in our lives, we got to remember how God has faithfully come through in the past and how He has worked things together for our good. We can look back over our life as Christians. We may have been Christians for like 10 years, 5 years, maybe 20 years, or however long it's been. We got to look back and set up little reminders of how God has faithfully come through for us in the past. David's life was marked with continual challenge one after the other. We don't see David had an easy road, but we see God gave him a road marked with favor and blessing. Whatever David encountered, God gave him the strength to get through, and God eventually brought him out of it in one piece. And so we see that in David's first stage, he faces the lion and the bear that tried to attack the sheep. And so David was given victory over that through the power of the Lord. He talked about how the Lord empowered David to strike down the lion and the bear. And we see shortly later, he encounters this behemoth giant man that was stood around 9 feet tall. That's a very tall, large man. I have seen large men, and if you see someone who's maybe 6'2", 6'4", 6'3", you think, wow, that's a large specimen of a man. I worked in a call center, and the actual head manager was like over 6 feet tall. He was a very impressively big human being. But this Goliath was actually even bigger. Goliath was 9 feet tall, and some of those wrestlers you see on TV, they're like 6 foot, maybe 7 foot at most. Actually, if you used to watch wrestling like I did, you'll find that one of the biggest people on there is only around 7'2" or 7'1", and so you don't really get much taller than that. But this Goliath was 9 feet tall. But David didn't let Goliath's size deter him from doing what he knew he needed to be done. Goliath was threatening the people of God, trying to discourage them and trying to mock God, and so David's like, I'm going to take this guy down. David's a small shepherd boy, young man, teenager at the time. God can use anybody to accomplish great things if we are fully trusting him and fully surrendered to him. It wasn't about David's size or skill. It was about his confidence in God that made all the difference. Saul was afraid of Goliath. Saul and his men were very afraid of Goliath, and so they were just kind of standing back, cowering, and David's like, I'll take him on. Now, let's think about Saul. Saul was a 6-foot man. Saul was at least over 6 feet tall. Saul was a very big man. But Goliath made Saul look small in comparison. So we see this 6-foot king, Saul, is afraid of Goliath. He had more of a physical advantage than David did, but David had the true advantage because he trusted the Lord his God, and that's what made all the difference. And God delivers Goliath into the hands of David, and David ends up doing away with him, and the Philistine army is freaked out by that, and they scatter away in terror as a result. And so later on, David transitions into another trial that he ends up facing. Not this time. It's not this time Goliath, a pagan Philistine. It is actually King Saul, who is jealous and enraged of David, and he wants to kill David, so he's taken his army to hunt David. And continually, throughout that span of at least, I would say, 13 years, Saul hunted David down, but God never gave him into Saul's hands. So we see sometimes opposition and trials can come in many shapes. In one case, it was the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, and then in another case, it was a godless Philistine, a pagan champion of war champion that made everybody afraid. But then we have this danger coming from this fake religious king who acted like he knew God, but was really displeasing to God. And Saul, in his jealousy and anger, wanted to kill David from the face of the earth. So, our challenges and trials can come in many different shapes and sizes and can last for a different amount of time each. But we see how God faithfully took care of David as David trusted him and did his will in spite of all these bad situations. David gets to the end of his life when he's talking to Solomon and says, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has brought me out of every trouble." I think that's a beautiful way David concludes his life. He's like, the Lord has delivered me out of every trouble throughout the entire span of my life. I trust him. I know he's been good to me. He has gotten me through it all. He has been good. And I think that should be our attitude when we're facing challenges. We've got to remember that God has brought us through things in the past, and he will get us through things today. God bless.